Tonight, we begin with a decision that U.S. officials had feared, Pentagon analysts had anticipated, and NATO commanders had prepared for since the earliest days of this conflict. A move that unfolded not over weeks or months, but in a matter of hours. Hours that reshaped the battlefield. Hours that sent shockwaves through the Kremlin's war room. Hours that may have fundamentally altered the trajectory of this war. What Russia did this week crossed a line that Washington had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with precision, with devastating force, and with a message that Moscow could not ignore. The United States, in coordination with its allies, delivered what officials are now calling a historic blow to Putin's war machine. A response so swift and so overwhelming that sources inside the Kremlin have described the mood as stunned. And what Ukraine did next left Russian military commanders scrambling to understand how they had miscalculated so badly. This is the story of that decision. This is the story of that response. And this is the story of a moment that may define the next chapter of this conflict. For weeks now, there had been signals, not official statements from Moscow, not formal declarations from the Russian Ministry of Defense, just signals that the Kremlin was preparing something unprecedented. Russia has been aggressive. Yes, but they have been predictable in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a cadence, almost a pattern that Western intelligence agencies have learned to read. But what set off alarm bells in Washington and Brussels this past week was that the pattern went silent. Analysts who monitor Russian military activity know the indicators, the unusual movement of strategic reserves, the repositioning of command and control assets, the sudden increase in encrypted communications between Moscow and field commanders, the abrupt departure of key military officials from the capital. All of that went quiet. And whenever the Kremlin goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Intelligence officials began tracking what they described as a communications blackout, a deliberate effort by Russian forces to minimize electronic signatures that Western surveillance could detect. This wasn't normal operational security. This was preparation. And the question on everyone's mind in the Pentagon, at NATO headquarters, and in the White House Situation Room was the same preparation for what? Early Tuesday morning, U.S. intelligence assets detected what they described as a significant repositioning of Russian strategic assets, including advanced missile systems that had not been deployed to forward positions in over 14 months. These are the kinds of weapons that Russia only deploys when they are signaling something very specific: escalation, desperation, or a fundamental shift in strategy. Observers didn't know which category this fell into or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Russia was changing its military posture. And when a nuclear armed adversary shifts posture without explanation, even by the smallest measure, every intelligence agency on the planet pays attention. Satellite imagery confirmed the movement of Iskander-M tactical missile launchers toward the Ukrainian border. Electronic surveillance detected a surge in communications between Russian military districts that had previously operated independently. And perhaps most alarmingly, sources reported that elements of Russia's strategic rocket forces had altered their readiness status. None of these moves on their own would have triggered the response that followed. But together, they painted a picture that Washington could not ignore. Russia was preparing to escalate, and the United States was about to make sure they understood the consequences. The warning issued by the Pentagon tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Official after official, briefing after classified briefing, described Russia's move as reckless, dangerous, and perhaps most importantly, indicative of a regime that is running out of conventional options. But escalation only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response today was among the most coordinated and devastating we've seen in over 2 years of conflict. Here's what we know. Within hours of detecting Russia's repositioning, Ukrainian forces launched a counterstrike that targeted the very systems Moscow had moved forward. These weren't the limited strikes we've seen in previous months. These were precision operations using Western, supplied long-range systems, weapons that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to fundamentally reshape the battlefield. The message was unmistakable: move forward, and we will push you back, threaten escalation, and we will respond with overwhelming force. And the United States, she is standing firmly behind Ukraine, made sure that message was heard not just in Russian field headquarters, but in the Kremlin itself. Tonight, Pentagon officials confirmed that Ukraine launched coordinated strikes on multiple high-value targets, including a forward command post that had recently been established for what analysts believe was a planned offensive operation. Ukraine struck before Russia could act. They hit the command post. They hit the logistics hub supporting it. They hit the air defense systems that were likely preparing to provide cover for Russian ground forces. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of Russia's planned operation, the command structure that would have coordinated it, the supply lines that would have sustained it, the protection that would have enabled it. This is what made Washington's warning so urgent. Russia's repositioning wasn't just symbolic. It was actionable. It represented the kind of move that could have dramatically escalated the conflict if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that, fully responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't strike civilian infrastructure. They didn't target population centers. They hit military assets. They hit command structures. They hit the very systems that Russia had positioned to threaten Ukrainian cities in Western resolve. And they did it with a level of precision that demonstrated exactly how far Ukrainian capabilities have advanced since the early days of this war. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. U.S. intelligence officials now believe that Russia's latest move was designed to test the resolve of the Western alliance after months of debate about continued military aid. Putin wanted to see whether Washington would blink, whether NATO would fracture, whether Ukraine would lose its nerve. But instead, the opposite happened. The United States didn't hesitate. They issued a response that was so swift, so unified, that even hardliners in Moscow noticed. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily. But today, the West did. Defense analysts speaking with major news outlets under anonymity described Russia's shift as coercive signaling, a way to pressure Western governments into reducing support for Ukraine. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and determined. Their strikes were not only effective, they were timed so precisely that Russian forces had no opportunity to disperse their assets before the weapons arrived. That timing matters because it shows intelligence coordination at the highest level. It shows that Ukraine is not simply reacting to Russian moves. They are anticipating them. They are preparing for them. And when the moment comes, they are executing with a level of competence that has surprised even their most optimistic supporters. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian missile forces carried out strikes on at least 4 forward staging areas, forcing Russian units to abandon prepared positions and retreat to secondary lines. Ukrainian drone units targeted fuel depots that had been established in the last 72 hours, depots that would have been critical for any sustained offensive operation. Ukrainian special operations forces operating behind enemy lines reportedly destroyed communication nodes used by Russian commanders to coordinate with frontline units. This wasn't just a counterstrike. This wasn't just a defensive response. This was a systematic dismantling of Russian offensive capability. This was strategic denial on a scale we haven't seen in months. And strategic denial is the one thing Russia has struggled to overcome since the earliest weeks of this war. For every advance they have made, Ukraine has countered with something that complicates their logistics, degrades their command structure, or exposes their vulnerabilities. Tonight was no exception. Remember, Russia thought this war would be over in 3 days. They thought Kiev would fall within the first week. They thought Ukraine's military would collapse its government would flee and Western support would evaporate in the face of nuclear threats. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine's military is stronger than it has ever been. Western support is more unified than at any point since the invasion began. And Russia's strategic position is more precarious than Putin ever imagined. The assumptions that guided Russia's invasion have been proven wrong at every turn. And today's events are simply the latest chapter in a story of Russian miscalculation and Ukrainian resilience that will be studied for generations. What makes this moment so significant and so dangerous is that Russia's latest move happened at a time when Putin is under extraordinary domestic pressure. Military hardliners want more aggressive action. Nationalist voices want total mobilization. Economic elites want an end to the sanctions crushing the Russian economy. And the Russian public, increasingly aware of the true costs of this war, wants answers. Putin is balancing these demands while fighting a war that has cost far more in blood and treasure than anyone in Moscow anticipated. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. Tonight's events must be understood in that context. Russia's escalation wasn't a sign of confidence. It was a sign of desperation. And Ukraine's response demonstrated that desperation will be met with determination. The Pentagon statement, now distributed to all major news outlets, was designed to signal that the United States is not willing to allow Russian escalation to go unanswered. Senior officials said plainly that Russia's repositioning of strategic assets was inconsistent with responsible military behavior. That is diplomatic language for, we see what you're doing, and there will be consequences. You don't usually hear that tone from the Pentagon unless something serious is at stake. The State Department echoed these concerns, with the spokesperson calling Russia's moves a dangerous escalation that threatens regional and global security. Meanwhile, NATO Secretary General issued a statement affirming the alliance's own wavering commitment to supporting Ukraine's right to defend itself. The message from the West was unified, it was immediate, and it was unmistakable. Russia's gambit has failed. And the cost of further escalation will be borne by Moscow alone. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Zelensky addressed the nation in a defiant, determined speech tonight. He said, "We will not be intimidated by threats. We have faced them before, and we have prevailed." He said, "Every missile Russia fires, every weapon they move forward only strengthens our resolve." And he said, "Tonight, our forces proved once again that Ukraine will not just defend, we will strike back, and we will win." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a nation that understands just how high the stakes have become. Zelensky's words were meant for multiple audiences. For Ukrainian citizens who need reassurance, for Western allies who need confidence, and for Moscow, which needs to understand that intimidation will not work. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's latest move wasn't isolated. Along with the repositioning of strategic assets, Belarus has also increased military activity along its border with Ukraine. Russian naval forces in the Black Sea have adopted more aggressive postures near Ukrainian shipping lanes. And Russian cyber units have increased attacks targeting Ukrainian infrastructure. All of this happened within the same 48-hour window. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. This wasn't a tactical adjustment. This was a strategic signal. And the West responded accordingly. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing a new offensive operation designed to break the current stalemate. Another is that Russia is attempting to pressure Western governments ahead of critical aid votes in Congress and European parliaments. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is attempting to establish new facts on the ground before potential diplomatic negotiations. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't wait for negotiations. They didn't defer to diplomatic processes. They didn't hope that restraint would be rewarded. They struck first, they struck hard, And they sent a message that any Russian advance will be met with immediate and devastating response. What we're watching now is a test of will. Russia wants to see whether the West will maintain its commitment under pressure. Ukraine wants to show that it remains capable of defending itself and projecting force. The United States wants to prevent escalation while supporting its ally, and Europe wants to prevent this conflict from spreading beyond Ukraine's borders. Each of these actors is watching the others, calculating their next moves based on what happened today. And what happened today was a decisive demonstration that the Western alliance remains united, Ukraine remains capable, and Russia's attempts at coercion will not succeed. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence officials who are now monitoring Russian communications for signs of how Moscow will respond. They say there are indications of confusion within Russian command structures. Units that expected to advance are now being ordered to consolidate defensive positions. They say that Russian military bloggers, usually a reliable source of Kremlin talking points, have gone notably silent in the hours since Ukraine's strikes. And they say Russia's decision to reposition strategic assets is likely part of a broader strategy intended to test Western resolve and create diplomatic leverage. But Ukraine is not backing down. In fact, Ukraine is doubling down. Their response today, swift, precise, and overwhelming, sent a message to Russia that miscalculation carries consequences. And it sent a message to the West that support for Ukraine is not charity. It's an investment in security that's paying dividends every single day. As the coming days unfold, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Russia hoped to achieve with this week's moves. But what we do know is that the Pentagon's warning was timely. It alerted Ukraine to the threat. It coordinated Western response. And it ensured that Russia's escalation was met with immediate and effective countermeasures. What happens next will depend on what Moscow does in the next 72 hours. If they retreat to previous positions, this moment will be remembered as yet another failed attempt at coercion. If they continue to escalate, Ukraine and its allies have already shown they are prepared. They have shown they are capable. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in weeks, the Kremlin appears to be recalculating. Moscow is quiet, too quiet. And when Russia is quiet, it means they are thinking. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Putin learned something he has learned many times before, but seems determined to forget. Ukraine will not surrender. The West will not abandon its ally. And every escalation will be met with a response that costs Russia more than it gains. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear: the historic blow delivered by the United States and its allies has shifted the momentum. Ukraine's counterstrike has left Russian commanders scrambling, and the Kremlin, for all its bluster, is running out of options. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.